Welcome everyone to our Leveraging Public-Private Partnerships for Vaccine Acquisition and Delivery in Africa. We will be starting momentarily.
Good morning and good afternoon to our esteemed speakers and the distinguished ladies and gentlemen in the audience. Welcome. I'm Farley Cleghorn, President and CEO of Corporate Council on Africa, the leading U.S. business association focused solely on connecting business interests in Africa. I want to thank you all for joining us today for our two-part series on leveraging public-private partnerships for vaccine acquisition and delivery in Africa. This forum comes at a critical time in Africa's fight against COVID-19. African governments, like their counterparts all around the world, are battling to acquire sufficient vaccine doses in a timely manner and at an affordable price to preserve their most valuable commodity, their people. This frenetic race against the clock is the only way to begin sustainable economic recovery. Currently, African governments are leveraging several strategies to accelerate vaccine and COVID-19 testing access, including reaching out directly to vaccine manufacturers, collaborating through the COVAX program and the World Health Organization, and working with the African Union's African Vaccine Acquisition Task Team, AVAT, to secure doses. Despite these successes, some projections indicate that Africa will not achieve widespread vaccination before early 2023 due to vaccine access, procurement, and infrastructure inequities. These alarming statistics are the reasons behind this webinar series, which will showcase how the public and private sectors can collaborate to close the vaccine financing gap and tackle the infrastructure and logistic challenges facing vaccine delivery and inoculation in Africa. This series will highlight key vaccine financing strategies on the continent, as well as technologies and leading solutions that the US and African public and private sectors can launch to facilitate efficient vaccine delivery across the continent. I would like to thank our exclusive sponsor, Citi, for their support of this forum. I am delighted now to welcome Riva Levinson, President and CEO of KRL International, as the moderator of today's discussion. Riva is also the award-winning author of Choosing the Hero, My Improbable Journey and the Rise of Africa's First Woman President, regarding President Johnson Sirleaf. And she is also a regular contributor to The Hill. But before I turn it over to Riva, I just want to go over some housekeeping rules for the question and answer period. Please use the Zoom chat function to send us your questions. We look forward to asking them should time permit. We will only take questions from those who have provided their name and affiliation. So please remember, when you submit your question in the chat, please also remember to put your name and your affiliation. And now let me welcome Riva.
Thank you, Farley, and thanks to CCA for organizing this timely session, and also kudos to the amazing team that's put this program together.
Thank you.
So I'd like to open with a few remarks, and then I'm going to turn it over to the panelists for a discussion and a webinar. And just pivoting off of what Farley said, Last week, Henrietta Fore, the head of UNICEF, reminded us that just a year ago, the world's scientists, its businesses, governments, philanthropists, and multilateral institutions did the unthinkable. They created vaccines to fight COVID-19 that had brought the world to a standstill, and they tested, transported, and began to administer those vaccines safely and in record time. And this is nothing short of astounding. This is what the world did in collaboration. But like we all know, the fight to control the virus and its more lethal and contagious variants is at an inflection point, with 90% of the doses in the hands of a few wealthy nations, leaving much of Africa, as Flory said, exposed. And this is despite the collaborative innovations of Africa CDC, of COVAX, and of the African Union's Africa Medical Supplies platform. And it's no longer about price. Anyone who has tried to move vaccines will tell you that. It's about access, supply, bureaucracy, capacity, and the product delivery to the last mile, the shots in the arms. So the debate for what should be done right now rages on. Do we compel, require, incentivize, unleash? Do we shame? How do we move to close the gap of vaccines in the arms? Ford, like others, has called for shifting gears, for proactive partnerships. She points to recent manufacturing collaborations, such as Pfizer and BioNTech, AstraZeneca, the Serum Institute, J&J and Merck, J&J and Aspen, and also for dose sharing commitments to help stabilize the global vaccine market. These are just a few. And into this timely debate, this CCA webinar and its eminent panelists to talk about leveraging public-private partnership for vaccine acquisition and delivery. So if I could ask, please, our eminent panelists to jump on and we can begin. If our panelists, please, could, there we go. If everyone could put their videos on, so I might take the opportunity to introduce. And for the audience, we kind of have a roving panel today just because of people's commitments. So we're gonna essentially respond by people's time commitments, and I'm gonna introduce the panelists now. First is Dr. Sabin Nsanzimana, Director General of the Rwanda Biomedical Centre. Dr. Sabin, can you wave? There we go. Thank you very much. Then we have Mr. John Finnegan, Managing Director and Head of Development Organizations for Citi. And I might point out the sponsor. Thank you, Citi, for this webinar. Hey, John, wanna wave? There we go. We have also Natalie Africa, who is Senior Advisor to the Director, Africa, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Hey, Natalie. And we have also Farley Cleghorn, who is MD, Global Health Practices, Palladium Group. And then finally, we have Ange Saraka-Yao, who is with the GAVI, the Vaccine Alliance, who's going to be joining later. So we're going to turn it over to our panelists. The way it's going to roll is everybody's going to make a few introductory remarks to set the stage for the challenge and the opportunity, and then we're going to roll with Q&A. So Dr. Sabin, over to you.
Great. Good morning, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure for me to be on this panel, connecting from Kigali, Rwanda. So under the Ministry of Health, Rwanda Biomedical Centre has been rolling out different vaccines and programs preventing diseases, and also currently combating this pandemic, COVID-19. And the experience we've acquired through much sectoral coordination and partnerships under these vaccination programs is that actually our vaccine program has been already rolling out more than 12 different type of vaccines. And recently, the most recent vaccine we've deployed on Ebola virus disease, ZEBOV, that currently 2 years of experience vaccinating more than 200,000 people at our borders with DRC, including other vaccines, mainly for children and adults for hepatitis B and C. We've seen that the necessity to have vaccines is key, but vaccine alone as a product is not the what we need now. Is actually one part of several other aspects that need to be put in place, including robust program that starts from logistics to supply chain to the community awareness and also acceptability of vaccines and partnerships. And COVID vaccine recently we acquired here, especially the vaccine that have some special conditions like Pfizer vaccine that we've been deploying for our healthcare providers and our frontliners has shown that getting one vaccine will always have different preparations in place. But ultra cold freezes vaccines that are needed. For us has been something we prepared even before with the Ebola vaccine that we deployed 2 years ago, as I say. But more other vaccines might be coming with different conditions and different considerations. And deployment and then acceptability and then also follow-up post-vaccinations are also critical. It goes with all the adverse events that we need to report and monitor because it's always need to know what is happening on the field and people's arms and systems after they are vaccinated. So we keep tracking on all these aspects, but it becomes all around one program that should be integrated in the health system and supported by different government institutions. So when it comes to this COVID vaccine, we've seen how important that many sectors need to work together from local government to health system, to finance, to education. So every single part of the health system has been involved in a way or another in vaccine deployment plan, but also implementation. And when you look at how access to vaccine is also key and sometimes complicated when every single country is looking for some number of doses more than the production, it becomes another challenge that we need to address in this kind of forum as partners, as manufacturers, scientists, as private sector and public sector, so that at the end of the day, what we want to prevent is a disease from point A to point B that will not even respect borders or whichever status, but more of a global context on how we stop these diseases and pandemics. So if you have more time, I would be happy to share more of our experience. But so far, we vaccinated almost more than 300,000 people on COVID-19. We're closer to 5% of the people we had intended to vaccinate in COVID-19. Our plan is to reach 20% by end of this year as soon as possible and reach 60% by next year. But we're still far away from achieving these targets, not because the plan or the preparations we're struggling to acquire more doses that are not coming as we wish, but we look forward to use the doses we're acquiring as quick as possible. Our plan, our strategy has been always, we don't want to store vaccines in a warehouse. Once they land in the country, they immediately deploy to the people in need, because this is how we can stop the spread of this pandemic. Thank you.
Thanks. Hey, Dr. Saban, I know that you need to run, but maybe you could, we're going to roll through the introductions of our panelists and ask you to stay for our first question, and then we will permit your departure, if that's okay, because I know from your team you have to run. So I'd like to turn it over next to John Finnegan from Citi. And John, over to you, a 2 to 3 minute introduction of what you're doing and what you want to talk about today to help guide the questions. Over, please.
Great. Well, thank you to CCA and everyone who has made time this morning to prioritize this virtual session. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. Again, John Finnegan, I'm part of Citi's global public sector practice. And within the global public sector practice, we have a dedicated organization that I am responsible for that covers global development organizations. So that includes the supranationals, the development finance institutions, NGOs, funds, and foundations. We have a number of common priorities, I believe, with all of you under Citi's mission of promoting economic development and social progress around the world. We focus on ESG, gender equality, financial inclusion, and we work with so many agencies, including the UN agencies that I think have been sort of mentioned in reference here on overall health, well-being, and so that's just a little bit about where I sit within the organization and in my areas of interest or points of intersection with the topic at hand today. I think to turn toward where I'd like to focus is particularly around looking at what Citi and other commercial bank partners in this public-private partnership world can do to close the financing gap and increase access to vaccines. So what I'll be speaking a little bit about is how we're reimagining and reinventing partnerships with development finance institutions, official agencies, NGOs, to essentially innovate how it is we're structuring deals. So the punchline is we're focused on apportioning out the risk to different parties that are best suited to take that risk. And I'll provide a few examples to bring that to life. I'll provide a few sort of social examples that focus on health and filling some critical gaps in sub-Saharan Africa. And then I'll also focus on some more, some large-scale examples of how we partnered with the development finance institutions to issue bonds in the capital markets to fight the consequences of COVID-19. So that is sort of a brief summary of where I'd like to focus today. I'd also, if time permits, like to wrap in a bit about technology and how it is that digitization it can actually also help accelerate on the healthcare front. And thank you, Riva.
Thank you, John. Feel free to interrupt any time to get your points in once the introduction goes through, but I took all those notes down. Hey, Natalie, over to you, please.
Thank you, Riva. So first, just a big word of appreciation to the Corporate Council on Africa for inviting the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to be part of this really important discussion. You know, a word about myself first. I'm based in Johannesburg, which is where the regional hub for the Gates Foundation in Africa is situated. So greetings to everyone from sunny Johannesburg. I think really what's important for me to get across today, Riva, is just the unprecedented level of action that I think we've seen in the continent during this last year when it comes to collaboration, when it comes to private sector engagement, and this is a subject I've worked on for about 15 years, just the role of the private sector in driving development, including in health. So I think it's really interesting that while, for the last 5 or so years, we've been talking about how can business help to accelerate the SDGs, we've seen this pandemic come up in the last year. And I think a lot of what many, development partners and all have hoped for in terms of that level of collaboration, partnership, we've seen a lot of that over the last year. So the trick, I think, is whether it can be sustained post-pandemic and whether some of the interesting initiatives that have been launched over the last year really can continue in some form or the other. So what I would probably want to focus on a little bit is just sharing some of those examples, from the Gates Foundation, everything we've tried to do around the pandemic, is focused on partnership and collaboration. So starting from our support for COVAX, for the ACT Accelerator, for the ACDC, for Africa Medical Supplies Platform that you spoke about, as well as other global initiatives, and then country level, programs, which I'll be happy to share some examples about. So I think that concrete action that's been taken is really what I'd like to share a bit with our audience, and then also maybe talk about some additional opportunities, that can come up as we look at this topic around financing and around acquisition and delivery of vaccines.
Okay, thanks, Natalie. The one comment that I would make is that I was involved both in the Ebola private sector mobilization 2014 and also geared up again for in 2019-2020 for COVID. And it does feel like you put so much innovation and precedent and you put it in place, but then after the crisis, those institutions, that collaboration, that innovation, it pauses and it doesn't reimagine or doesn't stay in place to be there for the next outbreak. So something definitely love to hear from you. And then Farley, we're turning it over to you, and then we're gonna start a round of questions, a general question for everyone, and then specific questions to dive into your expertise. Over, Farley.
Thanks, Riva. Good morning, everyone, and thanks to CCA for hosting this important webinar. My name is Farley Cleghorn. I'm an infectious disease physician and epidemiologist. I head the health practice at Palladium. Palladium is a global organization that is a partner to both development agencies and governments, and of course, multilateral agencies. We have a 50-year history of working around the world, including all over Africa. I myself have worked all over Africa. And we are essentially the middleman between funders and governments and doers. And part of our remit is to create, positive impact around the world in many sectors, health being our largest sector. And within health, we do a lot of things, but understanding the financial underpinnings of improved health systems and improved health performance is a big part of what we do. So understanding costs to implement, understanding projection of those costs, relation to impact, so cost effectiveness, and also understanding how to engage the private sector and leverage the private sector to help improve health performance in countries in Africa. This is exactly where the action is. In the past, we have tolerated as a global community long lag times for poorer countries to catch up to richer countries with health innovations. Flory mentioned that vaccines for coronavirus, the pandemic is a year old or 14 months old, has achieved sort of record results in a short time. And this is no accident. This is the outcome of vast investment by the public including taxpayers around the world, as well as, of course, collaboration of big pharmaceutical companies and the governments of countries where we need to get the vaccine into arms. And there are many barriers. We've heard already that supply is the biggest barrier today. And I just want to give us some statistics to set the stage for this discussion. Approximately 1 billion doses of coronavirus vaccines have been shipped or delivered. You can use either word, of which about 806 million doses have gone into arms. As of April 12th, of those, over 95% have gone into arms in rich countries. And in fact, if you try to get the actual number for Africa, it ends up at around 0.2% of doses delivered so far have gone into African arms. This is something that, of course, represents the gap that we're going to be talking about. And if you look at coverage in countries, if you take the example, I sit in Washington, D.C., we're up to about 22% coverage with full vaccination today overall in the United States. And if you take South Africa or Nigeria, not Rwanda, doctor, we're still at the 0. Maybe less than 2%. Let's put it that way. This is a gap that needs to be filled very quickly in order. Protection for the global community to end the pandemic can only occur when we have acceptable rates of immunization around the world. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Farley. And then my corporate Council on Africa colleagues, I don't see Marie has joined yet. Is that correct? I think that would be correct. It's a silence. So we're gonna turn over to our first question. Dr. Saban, I think you have 3 minutes. So I'm gonna turn a question over to you because I think we've all laid out the challenges, but this is a group that's looking to provide the solutions and to see if singular innovations that each has done, whether it's Citi in financing or Gates in public-private partnership or Palladium in its other operations, if those can be looked at, replicated, part of the gap closing, part of the effort that we're going to be putting together. And so I wanted to turn it over to you, Dr. Saban, in your last intervention with our panel, just to tell me about an innovation in Rwanda or the partnerships in Rwanda that you believe are narrowing that gap in real time. And if it's something that can be replicated and shared with the global community as we in the United States look to close that gap. I think I had mentioned on our prep call yesterday, we now have Gail Smith, who's been appointed by President Biden as the chief global vaccine coordinator, and trusting that her and her team are listening on this platform, this webinar. So over to you for your innovation and idea. No pressure.
Great. Thank you very much. I think the other panelists have mentioned very important elements in this partnership, and innovations generally are just trying to do what we all know, but maybe in a different way, or trying what can work and then see if it can help in a situation where we are. For example, in our context, when we started this small rollout of COVID vaccine in the past 1 month, we realized that we're not able to reach communities. The people want vaccinating, we're giving ourselves 1 week to give the first shot to the people we need to reach. But we realized that, for example, in the city of Kigali, where most of the people go to private clinics and health facilities, private facilities, working through these kind of channels, we even make it much faster. And public facilities are widely used in other provinces, but if you look at the capital, Kigali is a bit different. So by engaging all these channels, both at the access point levels, but also at the implementation levels, I can tell you how many people are engaged in the vaccine distribution. You will see that they're coming from public health facilities. Our main vaccine site is owned by private sector federation. That's usually where we host our different events for Expo annually. But now it's transformed into a facility for vaccination massively for people here in the capital of Kigali. And look at how many companies, private companies, banks have been involved and actually helping in vaccine logistics and deployment all around the national vaccine program. It has been very helpful. And on the side of technology, I think one of the panelists has talked about, I think it was John, it's inevitable to bring in technology into this partnership because you want to know where this dose is going, where is this client, and then when next time I want to reach out this person, we're talking about millions of people. We've deployed health systems, IT systems that were able to tell us at the level of geographical location where this person who received this vaccine will be reached in case of health support or intervention. And at the second dose, now that we are providing second dose for most of our healthcare providers, there's an immediate vaccination e-vaccine certificate that is provided, because you'll see that this vaccination is involving other aspects like tourism, travels, health. It's touching to all different sectors, and the only way to know who had received what, when, where this person is going to be, and how you check on this data, you need to have a very strong data system that we put in place, anticipating that this is going to be a key driver to people for next number of years. We don't know. And we don't know actually if we're going to get 2 doses or 3 doses or more. And finally, the level of partnership, that is where you see the importance of what we're doing here in Rwanda should be connecting to what is happening in the United States or in Asia or in Europe, because our people will be moving around. These vaccinated people will taking one shot here and another shot somewhere else. So you need really to track these informations, and we adapt ourselves to the people's movements instead of people struggling as we already struggled through this pandemic. So this IT part is very key. We are happy that all the people we vaccinated now have their certificates. They can be traced. They can be geographically traced even for adverse events. That is one. Then how the partners, the local partners in private sector have been involved, both at the level of supporting logistics and even giving their own facilities to be used as vaccination sites, has been really remarkable. And at the side of sustainability of these programs, how we reach our targets, we are now exploring how are we going to get these vaccines, this production of vaccines locally on our continent. As you know, the transport logistics is quite critical, and yet we are not going to stop vaccinating people. How can we facilitate these logistics and challenges on our continent? So Rwanda is looking into all these aspects, and how we can be in a situation where not only for our country, but also for our communities can be facilitated to get vaccines produced locally on the continent and reach millions of people in need.
Dr. Saban, thank you so much. I think you point out that there are really two things or two vectors of conversation for this panel, not enough time. One is the closing the gap, which is our immediate issue for global recovery and for equitable recovery. But the other is, what did we learn, and what Africa has to do differently in terms of owning more of the supply chain, the manufacturing, and the capability to move to that last mile. So hoping we have a conversation point for that. But I'd want to ask my fellow panelists if they want to jump in and ask anything of Dr. Saban before he goes, and otherwise we'll just move on to the questions. Natalie, John, Farley?
Dr. Saban, you said that you're aiming for 20% coverage. When do you expect to achieve that? And how do you expect to go beyond that?
Thank you, Farley. This 20% is a target for this year, 2021. So we are talking about 3 million people vaccinated, which is fairly, it's a number that we estimated those are most at risk, including healthcare providers, frontliners, all this, the first priority group that has to be reached. So far of this, we've reached closer to 300, between 300 and 400,000 people, which is a good start now. But moving forward to reach this number, we're working with the different organizations and partners. You've talked about COVAX as a first facility that we already engaged with. And actually our first delivery vaccines came through COVAX. And we're expecting some more, as I think it was yesterday when this new next wave of distribution locations through COVAX was announced. So we're happy to see that we expect some more doses coming to Rwanda and the other countries that are in need, but also the other arrangement and discussion that's ongoing, including through the African Union and also bilateral discussions that are underway. So we really want to get those as soon as possible. As you know, in many African countries, there are now indications of third wave of this pandemic surging in many countries. So far, we are still at the level of a controlled transmission, but we came up from a second wave that was in December, January, and we are doing our best to not get into the third wave before we reach out to this, I would say, phase one of these group vaccinations.
And any idea of variants circulating in Rwanda?
Yeah, we are conducting sequencing regularly here in Rwanda. Actually, weekly we are doing 60 samples sequenced, which is a good number. I think this has been a priority for our lab since the beginning of this pandemic. So currently, the data we actually published recently in a GSAID and a preprint paper that is probably soon going to be widely available. We found that of close to 400 samples sequenced recently, there were 12 some variants of concern that were detected among travelers arriving in Rwanda. Two of them had the variant like B117 that is generally known as mentioned as UK. I don't like to use this term, UK or South Africa variant, yeah. But I would use it just for people to get what I'm talking about. So the two samples that were UK variant and 10 among travelers who arrived with this South Africa variant. But in country, the circulating variant was not dominated by any of these two variants of concerns. And that's why at our borders, we systematically test everyone who is coming into the country at the airport as well. And all these 12 samples were detected at KRL International Airport among arriving travelers. And we keep sequencing samples just to make sure we control and also prevent these new variant transmissions. So this paper maybe talks about the details. I'll be happy to share the details with you, but it's already public if anyone wants to read about it. It has more details on also the regional dynamics and most of these travelers, which country they're coming from, and how we are doing this sequencing aspect.
Dr. Saban, I know that when David Pilling of the Financial Times traveled to Kigali during COVID, he was greeted by a robot and talked about the rapid diagnostic test and the efficiency of the airport. And I think that's also one of the innovations that Africa has brought, is the ability not only to require a 72-hour PCR, which now the US is doing, but also the testing at the airport with the rapid diagnostic. I know Ghana has done that. I've been traveling as well. But I think Farley and Dr. Saban, I think we're gonna try to roll to the innovations in finance and PPPs. And Dr. Saban, I wanted to thank you for joining. I know that I'm getting poked by your friends, by your colleagues about it's time for you to roll. So I think we'll move on to the conversation, but thank you so much for joining, and we hope the conversation continues. Okay.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Next time we stay longer. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks to your staff for this day. Hey, John, I'm gonna turn it over to you for a question, and then to Natalie and Farley, and then close out with some broader questions, but you talked about the blended finance. You talked about, John, the mitigation of risk using the Development Finance Corporation and others. I know that there's one of the issues for the vaccine manufacturers beyond the intellectual property rights is how to take steps to partner and to move forward in manufacturing and to mitigate what that supply risk or that demand risk looks like. So I'd be curious to understand what Citi is doing and what those, those programs are that can be shared. So over to you, please.
Sure. Thank you again. I'll give a couple of examples of how we've been able to embark on a risk-sharing framework, one of many that I think has helped enable finance. And then I will shift over to specifically a very rewarding assignment that Citi's been working on since October as the financial advisor to GAVI and the COVAX facility, with, of course, the aim to increase access, just, equitable distribution of vaccines. So in terms of the risk sharing, I mentioned a few of the headlines about apportioning out risk to those that are best suited to take it. And when it comes to developing—
Hey, John, one sec. I'm just going to introduce our final our final panelists. So one leaves, one comes. That's just the way it rolls in our busy lives. But I wanted to introduce Marie Ange Saraka-Yao. Hopefully I pronounced it right. If not, oh well. Managing Director, Resource Mobilization and Private Sector Partnership, Innovative Finance Department, GAVI, the Vaccine Alliance. And Marie, you've missed the beginning of the conversation, but we'll catch you up. But we're I'm turning it over to John right now to talk about his risk mitigation finance projects, and then we'll turn it over to you for a few remarks. So back, John, over to you.
Great, Riva, thanks again.
I'm very pleased to be here. Hello, John.
Well, welcome, Marie-Ange. Okay, I'll give the headlines so that I allow my fellow panelists to share as well. I think we have a limit on time, but in brief, we launched a risk sharing program that we refer to as Scaling Enterprise. It's a $100 million loan guarantee facility that allows us to provide early stage financing in local currency to companies that expand access to products and services for low-income communities in emerging markets. These, again, are the loans are made in local currency at an affordable rate to early-stage social impact companies to achieve scale, and quite often they expand access to finance, healthcare, energy, and other themes like affordable housing. So two quick examples: Gradient Health. There's a nonprofit social enterprise that distributes ventilators and anesthesia machines to 400 plus low resource clinics in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a unique aspect where there's a built-in oxygen concentrator that allows low resource clinics that are in rural areas without electricity to provide this in terms of needs and basic surgery. So that's one quick example. A second quick example is with BRAC. I think the second example is again a local currency deal. The general theme is financial inclusion for women in Uganda, but we were able to reach 17,000 micro and small businesses, 85% of whom are women. It's a last mile focus. It's a microfinance deal. It's an integrated approach. And the reason I wanted to highlight this is because it complements access to healthcare, education, and various youth employment programs. So again, those are two examples. I think the third, before I pass the floor, Riva, back over to you, is I did want to mention, and with Marie-Ange joining timely here, the partnership that we've established with GAVI, the Vaccine Alliance, as well as the COVAX facility. In terms of increasing access to vaccines, we're honored to be a part of this public-private partnership, and our role is really serving as financial advisor. Our role has really been to provide expert advisory consultative advice, and help GAVI and the COVAX facility really develop structures to mitigate sovereign liquidity and operational risk as the COVAX facility seeks to facilitate their pooled procurement and equitable distribution of vaccines. So we feel that this public-private partnership speaks to sort of who we are as a firm and what we're doing to help combat the crisis on many fronts. I'm going to pause here because I think we may be limited on time.
Yeah, John Ware. Hey, Marie. Maybe what I'd like to do is put a few questions that have actually come from Natalie that I think you and her would be really well poised to answer. And in doing that, Marie, you might be able to introduce yourself as you respond to the questions. But Natalie, thank you for the really thoughtful questions this morning. And one that jumped out at me and then I wanted to maybe put on the table is there have been some innovative public-private partnerships in vaccine acquisition and delivery. We talk about the SA Solidarity Fund, Business for SA, Vodacom, AUDA, NAPAD, Aspen, et cetera, one-on-one schemes. But I wanted to talk about the limitations and the challenges of the PPPs and how they can be more effective. And I'm going to pull this question, Natalie, from what you provided and turn it over both to you and to Marie to answer. And you talk about what are the limitations and challenges of the PPP engagement. And we talk about scarce supply, the issue of only the government can procure the vaccines, the unpredictability of the variants and the uneven uptake from the population. I know in working with the PPP in Ghana, as it is only the government that can procure, that there has to be a tight side-by-side cooperation with private sector in order to address some of those issues. So I wanted to put that challenge to you, Natalie, and then turn it over to Marie, who hasn't listened to the first part of the conversation, to jump in. Marie, if that's okay. Natalie, over to you, please.
Sure. Thanks, Riva. Yeah, so, despite what I said about there's been an unprecedented level of public-private partnerships, there are indeed some challenges. And when it comes to, I think now the vaccine part, which is what we're looking at in 2021, it's really that because of the scarce supply, and you put it very well at the beginning, so did Farley, it's really just governments that are procuring. So private sector organizations that want to be involved in procuring actually can't go out and buy on the market. But what we are seeing is they're finding other ways to support. So the Solidarity Fund in South Africa, for example, that we've been proud to support, they actually put a down payment for South African government when it made its financial commitment to GAVI last year. So they did actually work directly alongside government to help ensure procurement. Likewise, in Nigeria, the Coalition Against COVID, CACOVID, has also committed to supporting the government to help procure vaccines. So there's the direct financial support where they've tried to overcome that limitation by working directly with government. But I think one of the challenges is the fact that there is this unpredictability of supply. Private sector works on more direct demand supply, modalities. And the fact that this vaccine situation is so up in the air does make it difficult for corporations who want to be more proactive, who want to start rolling out vaccines to their workplaces. They can't do that yet for their staff, and then of course the fact that variants have now come to throw a spanner in the works, which means even if they go out and try and say, we'll work alongside governments to commit to supply, variants may be, for example, like in South Africa, have posed an obstacle to the actual rollout of that vaccine, even when private sector was ready to work alongside the government. Then we had to go into a different type of operation around the J&J vaccine and using that as a clinical study, and so it's that constant, I think, adaptability that the private sector has had to find in terms of dealing with the unpredictability of the situation. Also the uptake, we're seeing in many countries that even though Africa is getting very limited supply, we're also seeing that the uptake is not fully understood. So many governments have started, for example, with saying, let's prioritize health workers first. We're seeing that the uptake from health workers isn't always as strong as we thought it would be. in terms of vaccine hesitancy and so on, right? And so again, for private sector to be able to perhaps help with modeling that kind of predictability around uptake is something where they can perhaps support governments to do that, because it's again not a clear demand and supply situation because of the fact that we're having to assess, you know, every day what the uptake will actually be like. What will it be like in rural areas? So the kind of technology systems that the private sector can maybe help government with could perhaps support some level of modeling and you know, predictability in terms of where are we really going to go. If we have X amount of supply, what can we realistically expect in the next 12 months, for example, in terms of rolling out, segmenting population? So I think helping to bridge that barrier in terms of expectations could be, it's a limitation, but it can also be an opportunity, I think, for more private sector support to governments.
Thanks, Natalie. Marie, following Natalie, I'd love for you to respond to that, and in doing so, just give us a sense of the innovations that have come on your side. Over, please.
Thank you, and it's very nice to see some familiar faces, John, but also Natalie, that I have not seen in a while, so it's really nice, and thank you for the opportunity. And my apologies, I was in a board meeting with my stakeholders, and they also had a lot of questions for me. So, but I mean, to answer the question, I do think, and we see that this partnership, public-private, is very important. It may have constraints, but, you know, rightly put, it's actually probably the best combination, as Natalie was just saying, for opportunities and to being flexible. I think what, you know, we have to be mindful that until the end of 2021, at least, we are in a supply constrained environment. I think, you know, we have to be clear. Typically, the vaccine market per year is 3.5 billion doses, and we are trying to produce 14 billion doses. And basically, and only a few firms have been pre-qualified, as you know. So, of course, more will be coming up, but, you know, just that ramp up is just extraordinary. And so for us, you know, at GAVI, in a sense, the way we think about the public-private partnership is first, of course, with the vaccine manufacturers, right? Because they are private partners too. And it's really, in a sense, you know, finding that balance of creating a market for, you know, especially the low and middle income countries that we are trying to serve, in a sense that, you know, would not have access to the vaccine easily, and incentivizing, in a sense, that demand and that market, so that that market can be created. So that's how, you know, we develop the advanced market commitment, which is the vehicle with which we are front-loading financing to basically reserve doses early on from vaccine manufacturers to be able to start, you know, procuring and delivering vaccine. So that's the first part of the partnership, and it's very important. And the way the financing also is raised is very important, because here the key is to have advanced financing. Natalie has been talking about the lack of supply, but that lack of supply can only be resolved if we do have financing upfront, because basically what you have to do is to reserve so that they build the capacity and you create the market, and as we go, we have more doses. But also on the financing side, you know, we have this financing instrument called IFIM, which basically are vaccine bonds that we are issuing on the market, and that is being bought by the private sector and by individuals, that allow us, against long-term commitments of governments, to have the money now and actually to be able to invest in reserving these doses. So the doses we started flowing 6 weeks ago by COVAX in the 6 continents, were basically from bonds that were issued in September, October. So you do have this lead time that you need to think about, but the private sector also can help there, because of course they are buying the bonds. And of course here what's very important, I know there may be frustration because private sector may want to get into more the vaccine procurement. And it's true that because it's a public health issue, and most likely in a pandemic in the short term, because the supply is constrained, and also because of the risk, frankly, that's typically first managed through government. But one thing that we say all the time, vaccines do not deliver themselves, and vaccines are not vaccination. And the private sector can really be at the forefront of the vaccination, especially on the logistics, on the delivery. That's extremely important. One of the challenge, of course, with some of the vaccines that, for COVID-19 vaccines, is that, they need to be delivered quickly. There's a cold chain requirement. And here we have been working with a lot of companies in terms of innovating. You may know that we have been working with some of the companies and the drone companies to deliver, for example, in Ghana and other places, 24/7 the vaccines. But of course, there's a whole part also about data and monitoring that is very important. So I do think that while it can be felt sometimes that is constrained, the collaboration of both can really help in the innovation. And for us, particularly, of course, in financing, but also in some of the technology and innovative delivery that are key.
Hey, Marie, Ange, I apologize, but I can't believe we have like 5 minutes left. I have no idea where the time went. So I am going to put a question on the table and see if everybody can, answer it. And I'm going to start with Farley, who I've been remiss, Farley, in not being able to get to your questions. But this question, I think, summarizes all the ones you gave me, right? Which is that I think it's 15 April, which is Thursday. Is that right? Thursday?
Yeah.
The United States is going to host an event to launch a 2021 COVAX investment opportunity. It's going to be hosted by President Biden. Secretary Blinken's going to be there to talk about what you do in this space right now with public-private collaboration to close the gap and to look towards the future. You have 1 minute to tell this US-hosted event what you would do, and then we're going to turn it over to all of our colleagues, including Marie. We want specific recommendations. Gail Smith is listening.
Hi, Gail. It's clearly important, as we've heard from both John and Marie-Ange, that raising the money, that's mobilization, de-risking the investments, sharing the investment risk, this is all very important. But these are also methods that we have been adopting in the past. The gap in Africa applies not only to coronavirus vaccines, it applies to all of the inputs into health system improvement, whether you're talking about sterile inputs for surgery, you're talking about solid dose formulations for hypertension, you're talking about childhood vaccines. The gap exists. The global pharmaceutical market is hesitant to invest in Africa because it represents the smallest proportion of return on that investment. Injecting finance into that equation changes the equation so that they are more willing to do so. The supply constraint that we have for coronavirus vaccines today is a production constraint primarily. We simply have never tried to do this before, which is to produce 14 billion doses of a product and give it to everyone. So there's no question that we have to temper our ambitions, because we can't go from where we are today to where we want to be easily or conveniently. We have to temper it. The COVAX ambition of 20% speaks to impact, who will be hospitalized and die. That is very important. Also in maintaining the health systems by vaccinating healthcare workers.
Hey, Farley, you have 5 seconds to close. Sorry.
so production, that is the problem.
Absolutely. And I know that's what the AFDB and the African Investment Forum is focusing on in terms of the production and making sure that Aspen isn't the only information innovation chair. There's not in Kenya, not in Ethiopia, not in Ghana, etc. Hey, John, I know you have to run, so I'm going to give you your opportunity to put something on the agenda for the US host event to launch 2021 COVAX investment opportunity. Over to you.
Sure. Thanks again, Riva. I'll keep it. I'll keep it brief, but I would say that
that's all you got. 40 seconds.
All right. Expanding the donor base. To Farley's point, the injecting the finance into healthcare is one portion or one piece. And I'll say from a commercial bank perspective, strengthening the fund and the COVAX facility through donor funds, whether that's a G20 nation, a foundation, even the private sector. I think that strengthening the fund through incremental donor contributions is key.
Natalie, over to you.
So I'll say really, Riva, it's about how can Gail and others look now towards sustainable solutions so that if this happens again in 3 years' time, Africa's not in the situation. Finding sustainable solutions to production, to manufacturing is really what we need to be focusing on now. We are talking about models in the Gates Foundation around like a hub and spoke model for manufacturing, where developing countries can have the capacity to produce, other epi vaccinations at the time when there's no pandemic that can easily be converted for vaccines for something like COVID when that comes up. This would require blended finance from public-private, organizations, and is a huge opportunity. And so, locating the manufacturing where it's at the cost that it's at, is really what we think is the sustainable solution, and that we hope that others will begin to really put on the table in the coming weeks and months.
Hey, Marie, over to you. Marie, you're on a mute.
Sorry, it's really working both on the short term and the medium term. On the short term, as John said, having this advanced money, diversifying the base with blended finance, with donor, MDBs, leveraging private finance in the capital market is very important, because it's about boosting the production of those who already have the capacity. Because, building a production, as Natalie is saying, it takes time. And so, so you do need to invest now for a medium-term solution. And we have seen it. We have invested, both GAVI and the foundation, over 20 years in what is now some of the most important production in India or Brazil and elsewhere. So it is a medium-term solution. So it's very important to be mindful of this. But it has to start now. And I think it's important in this to start investing, but knowing that this will probably not tackle the pandemic of 21 or 22. It is about also expanding the current capacity, having more manufacturers being pre-qualified. And of course, another key element in this partnership also is, of course, encouraging the countries that have more doses to share these doses, because it can help, of course, reduce the constraint that we have right now. We have to be mindful that those who buy early have more than the capacity, the excess that they need for their population. So creating a marketplace like that, and that's what we are trying also to do with COVAX. So these doses can go through COVAX and can be reallocated equitably.
Yeah, thanks, Marie. Natalie, Farley, I think John jumped off. We do have a couple of time for a couple of questions from the audience that will roll in, but I just wanted to ask Marie and Natalie, we talked about the private sector participation in the supply chain, in the delivery of the shots in Ghana. And I think you both know there's a company, M-Pharma, and M-Pharma is looking at providing more responsibility and ownership, not in the purchase of the vaccine, but in bringing the vaccine in countries, supporting through government the less vulnerable, but also having major companies take the responsibility of vaccination as a long-term issue for their employees, the protection of their employees, and the ability to shore up the private sector infrastructure. And I know that's been a request in all parts of the world, having the employers take more responsibility in this pandemic and taking the burden off of government. I just wanted to know what you both thought about that issue from a PPP perspective. And again, it's about adaptability, flexibility, and pushing and pulling till you figure out how governments and private sector can work together in the constraints. Over, Natalie and Marie, to you. And then we're going to turn it over for, I guess, 2 questions from the audience and Flory close. Over, please.
Yeah, Riva, I think that's a no-brainer. If we want to reach people as quickly as possible, as Marianne said, we have a crisis right now. Bringing in the private sector, we heard from Dr. Nsanzimana from Rwanda, where he said right now in Kigali, the biggest facilities for vaccinating people are actually private sector facilities, right? So I think that's something that many countries are gearing up to. A lot of private sector organizations are really gearing themselves up, trying to understand the safety modalities around vaccinating in the workplace. And, some private insurance companies are also offering to pay one-for-one, in terms of paying, covering their members and also covering government. So I think it's both around, helping to finance the delivery and actually delivering directly as private sector. So I think the more that we can provide guidelines on a regional level to be able to support countries to do this, to support private sector operations, large and small, to be able to do it, the quicker we'll reach the targets that we need. And we know right now supply is very scarce, but we're all hoping that through tech transfers and other, means, by the end of the year or early next year, there'll be a bigger supply on the market. And when that happens, we know that the public health systems run the risk of being overwhelmed. And so bringing in other private operators to be able to support the vaccination rollout will be essential.
Thanks, Natalie. Marie, you shook your head a lot. So I'd love for you to jump in on what Natalie said, and then we'll pull from the audience, which is a question for Farley. Over, please.
Definitely, and I was shaking because I know that already at the regional level, the African Union, for example, had a declaration, actually even just before the pandemic, really of encouraging the private sector to take, some of these segment of healthcare providers, and this is really encouraged. In a sense, because they are quite resourceful, innovative, effective, and here it's also a race, right? So I think if they can help do that and complement other services, of course, that's most important, and we really support this.
Hey, John, just a question to you. We spoke about it before the conversation went. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing the questions from audience, and we're a bit at a time, but you talked about the concern for the vaccines themselves, the concerns that today, for example, J&J has halted in the US because of clots. We've had the issue of vaccine hesitancy because some of the rollout around AstraZeneca. We're hearing about concerns about Sputnik, as well as the Chinese vaccine. And you had some ideas or some recommendations about how to ensure that these vaccines that go in, their supply, their delivery, but they have to be effective, and they have to be also something that people want to take because they know it'll protect them and outweigh the risk. I just wanted to put that to you. It's a bit of a loaded question, but I know you're prepared for loaded questions. So over, Farley.
Thank you, Riva. There's no question that when we talk about vaccines, we want to be talking about approximately the same things. And as we know, these vaccines are actually slightly different, both in their technology platforms, in their approvals processes by what we call stringent regulatory authorities like the FDA, and in the data that is available to the public. For example, on, say, Sinovac, Sinopharm, and Gamaleya from Russia. There are many other products in the pipeline, up to 200. The problem with treating all of these as equivalent is that we are learning as we go. And so some may veer off into a different category, which you reserve for specific purposes. And some may prove to be as useful as, say, Pfizer and Moderna are proving to be, where post-use effectiveness data matches the efficacy data in the clinical trial. So the promise is realized, and what we need to do is get it into people's arms. So unfortunately, there is this wide variation in the effectiveness of the products. They have different side effect profiles. All of this has to be incorporated into this rapid rollout and delivery. And because of the different technology platforms, we have very few plants around the world in the developing world that can actually do this kind of manufacturing. And even Aspen, which is the one in Africa that we've talked about, it's located in Durban and the Eastern Cape. You know, they're essentially getting product and packaging it. And that is something that we can do elsewhere. There's no question. We need the investment to be able to do that.
Hey, Farley, thanks. So it looks like time to give closing remarks other than a grand thank you, Farley, to you, to Natalie, to Marie, to our colleagues who had to leave. I think I hear maybe just two private sector takeaways just from the last close of the conversation that could be compelling in terms of looking forward. Natalie, you talked about allowing, guidelines or of how the private sector and government should collaborate to give the comfort, to have that adaptability and flexibility in terms of private sector participation. I think we learned from Ebola that sometimes governments just want money to be able to purchase, but at the end of the day, during Ebola, the ability to provide logistics and the ability to support the ETUs and other things were the most critical element of the private sector. And so how in COVID, how do you make sure that the private sector is not in a limiting role, but in an expansive role that really helps on this delivery? And like you said, it's a no-brainer for employers in the longer term to hold some of that responsibility, particularly the big responsibility. So that's a takeaway I hear from Marie and from Natalie. I think Flory unfortunately had to roll. So I'm just going to thank everybody for the conversation. And just in terms of the challenge, and I know that Biova, you're on this call, but it would be nice to be able to pull the main recommendations from this conversation and feed them into what we believe is going to be a global dialogue on Thursday, hosted here in the United States. We did Operation Warp Speed to develop these vaccines. There should be a operation under a new name and branding to be able to deploy and to be able to provide equity and to be able to meet this gap, because we've done the impossible. We've done the impossible with these vaccines. The possible is definitely there. So maybe not Operation Warp Speed, but audience, there's still almost 100 of you there. Any ideas for branding, hashtag, throw it to CCA, we would welcome it. So thank you, everybody. And we're going to close off from CCA. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Riva.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.